to be fair, I did not come up with the category. I'm just going to tell you all about it. But first, it's been a fantastic week, or beginning of the week here with Restaurant Spaces. So I just want to say thank you to Influence Group for putting this all together and to the suppliers. This has been an absolutely fantastic time and couldn't be a more beautiful place than Santa Barbara. So for those of you who've met me before, I'm sorry you've heard all of this, but for those of you who haven't, I'm Meredith Sandland, and I most recently wrote this book, Delivering the Digital Restaurant, which is about all the change that's occurring in our industry, why it's happening, and we got the great good fortune of interviewing about 100 different industry leaders from restaurants, from technology companies, to understand what's changing, why it's changing, and what, importantly, restaurants can do about it. Prior to that, I was the Chief Development Officer at Taco Bell, which is why I'm no stranger to Restaurant Spaces. I spent a lot of time here. And it was a very fun time to work in development at Taco Bell because we were really trying to figure out how to reignite our growth after the 2008 real estate meltdown, part of which was around figuring out how to go into urban environments. We created the Taco Bell Cantina, and there's now, I don't know, maybe 150, 200 of those out in the wild, which is pretty neat to see. But as we were trying to figure out how to enter Manhattan, I thought, you know, it's weird that we're paying the world's most expensive real estate prices when 40% of our sales go out the door delivery. And my head of architecture and I looked at each other and we said, wouldn't it be great if there was a commissary that you could just make tacos in and deliver directly out of that commissary? And fast forward a couple of years, I met the guys at Kitchen United, who at the time were 3 guys at an old culinary school. And I walked in and I thought, oh my goodness, they're making the thing that I, as the customer, the head of development at a big national chain, wish existed. And what you see up here on the picture is the Kitchen United mixed location. That's a ghost kitchen inside of a Kroger, in this case a Ralph's, one of their brands in California. If you have time and are driving between here and LAX, you should stop in Westwood at this Ralph's and go see the Kitchen United. It is amazing, and Sargenti, who's here, worked on this particular iteration of it. It is perfect. And what it does is bring restaurant food into grocery in the form of a ghost kitchen, but it also has a customer pickup point and can also serve as a delivery point for things that are in the grocery store that aren't necessarily in the ghost kitchen. So think like the sushi bar or the deli, what have you. And it makes putting up kitchens inside of a grocery store almost as easy as a Starbucks kiosk that's right behind it. Not quite, because it still involves some black iron and things like that that are a little bit more difficult, but it is quite an amazing thing and worth going to see. I am currently the CEO of a company called Empower Delivery. This company was spun out of Cluster Truck, which is a vertically integrated ghost kitchen, and that's the picture that you see behind me here, but more on that later. So what is a killer category? Killer category, once a model is proven, it grows more rapidly than other categories. So think of examples in our space like casual dining or QSR. These are categories of restaurants. And what happens inside these categories is once it's been proven, many different brands will adopt the same business model, the general consumer journey, the general economic model, but they'll serve different food with different brand positioning within that. The model will meet an unmet consumer need, and then because it therefore delivers greater in value and convenience to the consumer, it takes off. And why should this room in particular pay attention to coming models? Well, as restaurants innovate, greater in value and convenience delivered to the consumer adopts these things. That creates restaurant unit growth, which for everyone in this room creates spend and jobs. And the converse side of that is that if you're working for a brand who does not figure these things out, the brand will start to die. Existing brands can actually become obsolete or become often what I'll call a zombie brand, which is to say they continue to exist because they exist. They have great real estate, people have heard of them, but they're not really growing anymore. And chains added about 8,000 restaurants a year during the last peak boom growth time. That was during the mid-2000s, which means just on those incremental restaurants, they were spending about $10 billion a year on building out new restaurant infrastructure, excluding rebuilds, excluding remodels, all those kinds of things. And in 2008, when the real estate crash happened, that number went from about 8,000 to about 4,000, and then down to about 2,000. And then, of course, COVID happened. So we've really been like bumping along the bottom in terms of our historical unit growth as an industry for quite some time. And I think we need something to drive the next wave of growth in our industry. So if you look way back, zoom out at the macro level, our restaurant growth over time, estimated between 1930 and 2020, has gone up about 6x. Just over half of that was driven by the underlying population growth as the US got bigger, and just under half of that was driven by increased usage of restaurants. The restaurants per capita was increasing over time. That's because the population that was there was using restaurants more often. But usage increases don't just happen. And I think a lot of times we talk about what's changing with the consumer and why the consumer is using restaurants more. Things like increased need for convenience, women entering the workforce, those have been big drivers in our industry over the last 30 to 40 years. But there's also innovation that's happening on the restaurant side that's pushing that increased adoption. So you've probably seen the S-curve adoption model before. It was a concept popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in the book The Tipping Point. And we tend to find that we'll have innovators, very small number of them, who use a new approach. Then our early adopters who historically have lived near the innovation start to adopt it. Now, that happens in communities. Sometimes now today, those communities are online, but it tends to be kind of a close-knit group of people who see the innovation and are exposed to it and then adopt it. Then we have our early majority who adopt it as availability increases. And then our late majority comes on board when the cost comes down. And this has happened in our industry over time as restaurants per capita have increased. A lot of what's happening is that restaurant innovation, as we go through those business model waves, we are figuring out how to make restaurants more available, right? We're putting them closer to our consumer. We're putting them more frequently around town. And then we are bringing the cost of restaurant food down. So what that ends up looking like on 100% stack bar over time is that you're going to see these categories come on board, and this is what everyone in this room is spending their time building. So at first, we had a whole lot of full service, and as a percentage of total, that went down as our counter service, you can think of like your early drugstore models came into play. And I think, to me, those drugstore models are like a precursor to what eventually became like a sandwich shop or a Subway, something like that. Next, you had the QSR wave come in, and that really took over. Then delivered pizza, casual dining, fast casual, and then finally this little tiny slice up there that I'll talk about, the digital natives. And I think that those are the ones that are coming next that we will be building for. So just to run through these quickly, you remember, old school fine dining, it was special occasions, it was fancy and expensive. So like my grandmother, 13 of 13 children, almost never ate at a restaurant. If she did, it was like, something major and amazing had occurred to cause her to go out. When counter service came in, it was more convenient because they were more available, and it was less expensive than a full service dining experience. And we had family dining come in. It kept that inexpensive positioning, but was more accommodating. You could bring an entire family in. Then we got QSR, and here we got extreme value, extreme convenience. And if you remember back to the chart, a couple charts ago about the restaurant growth, the really big uptick in restaurants per capita in the US occurred as QSR took over. And then if you remember back the chart of different categories and how they were coming into play, QSR really took a big slice of that, right? Because it made it so available and so low cost that Americans could afford to adopt more eating out, more restaurant behavior. Next, we got delivered pizza. This picture of Domino's is kind of terrible, and I'm sure if they were here, they'd be horrified that I used this particular picture, but I used it on purpose because it is an inline unit in an out-of-the-way place. It's not fancy, right? And this is how most delivered pizza is. It is not at Main on Main. It is not offer any sit-down experience. It does not have a lot of branding associated with it. Its job is to deliver a pizza. It is engineered for delivery, and we'll come back to that idea. Next, we had casual dining come in, and it offered better food than QSR, but at half the price of fine dining. It also offered consistency, and over time became relatively ubiquitous. And most recently, we've had fast casual. And what fast casual did is kind of brilliant. They said, you know, nobody really actually cares about the server at casual dining. Let's just dispense with that and reinvest that labor cost in our food. So fast casual is known for having really good food for a really affordable price. But, you know, it's a little inconvenient, right? They tend to be inline units. They tend to be in more dense urban areas where it's difficult to find parking. And I think a lot of the rise of delivery has been a solution to deal with the inconvenience for places like this. And when you kind of summarize all of those categories that drove those increasing waves of restaurant builds in the US over time, we start with a very high price that brings us experience. And then we say, well, how do we make it more convenient and cheaper? We'll get QSR. Okay, well, how do we make it even more convenient? We'll deliver it to people, but we're gonna have to charge more. And then, all right, what if we charge that same price, but we gave more people more food for their money? And then finally, what if we took that labor cost away and reinvested in the food? And you see kind of a steady trend here. You know, there's a little bit of bouncing guardrail to guardrail in terms of price points and in terms of what percentage of the consumer dollar consumers are getting back in the form of food. But there's a steady trend here marching in the direction of making food more convenient and giving consumers more food, either in the form of quality or in the form of actual quantity, for less, right? So that's where we're headed. The problem we have now is that even with the innovation in fast casual, restaurants are still incredibly labor intense. So it's a picture of a QSR from 1978 versus today. Looks pretty much the same. They're operating very similar equipment. And as you all know, labor is a huge problem in our industry right now. Hourly turnover in restaurants is high. Wages are going up. And there was a Boston Fed study that came out that said it isn't about people not wanting to work. It's actually baby boomers are retiring. And we did not have enough kids, and then we shut off immigration during COVID, so here we are. And that suggests to me that this labor problem is not going away. It is not temporary. We as an industry are stuck with this new reality of not enough labor, and therefore labor being more expensive. Alongside this, you have an industry that feels like it's starting to bifurcate. And Jonathan Mays wrote about this and said, what he thinks is happening is there's an experiential form of restaurants that are coming out, and then there is a highly efficient form. And the pictures you see up here are a True Food Kitchen on the left-hand side, and then a Kitchen United on the right-hand side. And how different is it to be able to look into the kitchen, see what they're making, lots of wood accents, so beautiful, you want to be in that space, versus a conveyor belt, right? Those are totally different things. And you're starting to see that happen already, in part, I think, in reaction to this cost associated with labor, but also with building costs. The other thing that's happening is that we're starting to see the electrification of kitchens. And I'm sure most of you who are not from California in this room think, oh, California's just crazy, this will never happen to me. But there are several cities in California that are already banning the use of gas and requiring a shift to electric-based cooking. And I think that this is going to happen. And the reason why I think this is going to happen is not so much because cities are making it, but if you imagine a car, a Tesla is all electric. Is it all electric because they love electricity? Yeah. I would argue no. It's all electric because it's much easier to automate something that is electric versus something that is combustion. If we were to try to automate a gas range, not only do we have to be able to turn up and down the gas, we also have to then see what happened, right? There's a little bit of a delay between the change that we make and the outcome that we receive as we're cooking. But with electricity, that's much, much easier to measure and to find out how the system is responding to the changes that the automation makes. So when you put all of these things together, incredibly expensive labor cost, the desire for a steady march of the consumer toward better health and more value for their dollar, I think where we end up is a delivery optimized kitchen, which is going to be an even more convenient convenience. Now, the version of this that I have up behind me is a company called Cluster Truck, which is a vertically integrated ghost kitchen in Indianapolis. It is the largest and most profitable ghost kitchen in America. They do about $8 million worth of sales out of a single unit, 100% delivery, which sounds, I think, probably crazy relative to what most people are experiencing. And they are able to deliver to their consumer in 29 minutes with no menu markups and no delivery fees, which again, sounds crazy relative to what all of us, I think, are experiencing in the industry right now. But the way that they're able to do that is through the use of technology and software and through the use of a purpose-built facility where it's totally focused on doing that one thing right. And we've spent a lot of this week talking about how do we do all things? How do we become all things to all people? How do we take a sit-down restaurant and do more carryout? How do we take a drive-through and incorporate, consumer pre-ordering? How do we have double drive-through lanes? How do we accommodate the delivery driver when they come into the restaurant? And this concept says, I'm not going to try to be all things to all people. I'm going to go back to how it used to be, and I'm going to design the thing to be the thing and to be the best version of that thing it can be, which is very similar, if you remember, to our example of delivered pizza. I'm going to make the thing the best thing that it can be. The picture that you see up here on the right is something that Rationale, which is a equipment provider over in Europe, has put together, which is a little tiny QSR optimized for delivery and pickup that can be run by one person, all electric. And you can imagine if it's all electric, it can be automated. So when you put all of that together, I think that what's going to happen is that our next category that comes out is going to be able to deliver better value, better experience, better convenience to our consumer. And this is a pretty crazy statement to say because I know our industry is very fond of the 30-30-30-10 approach of restaurants. I think they could give up to 40% of the consumer dollar back to them in the form of food. And they will do that through electrification, automation, ghost kitchens, delivery, all of these little bits and pieces that everyone's experimenting with today inside their current restaurants, inside of a purpose-built restaurant. If you all want to hear more about these kinds of things, like the future that's happening, certainly the book, good place to find it. And then we also host a podcast every 2 weeks called the Monday Minute, where we talk about a lot of the headlines that are occurring and how they affect our restaurants today. Thank you.